The day my sister's husband handed me a termination letter at my own desk, I didn't say a word. I just looked at him, really looked at him, and I thought about how my father used to call him the future of this family. That was 3 years ago. Now I know exactly what my father meant. He just wasn't talking about the future my brother-in-law had in mind. My name is Elliot Marsh, and I'm 31 years old. I grew up in a small town called Pemberton, about 2 hours north of Vancouver, in a valley so green in the summer it almost hurts your eyes to look at it. My father built a timber supply company from scratch. Nothing glamorous, just hard work and a reputation for keeping his word. By the time I was old enough to help out on weekends, Marsh Timber had contracts with half the construction firms in the interior. My father never talked about the money. He talked about the relationships. "A handshake means something, Elliot," he used to say. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. He died 18 months ago, pancreatic cancer. Fast and merciless, the way it always is. My sister, Vivienne, is 7 years older than me. She married her husband, Dorian, when I was still in university. I was a groomsman at the wedding. I gave a speech about family. I meant every word of it. After my father passed, I came back to Pemberton to help keep the company running. I hadn't planned to stay long. I had a job in Kelowna, an apartment, a life I'd been building slowly. But my mother was overwhelmed, and the company needed someone who knew it from the inside. So I stayed. I worked 14-hour days for 8 months. I renegotiated 3 supplier contracts that were bleeding us dry. I brought in a project manager from Prince George who restructured our delivery routes and saved us nearly $80,000 in fuel costs alone in the first year. I thought I was doing something good. I thought we were holding the family together. I didn't know that Dorian had been quietly repositioning himself since the funeral. The morning it happened, it was a Tuesday in November, cold outside, the kind of gray sky that sits low over the valley and doesn't move. I'd been in early, going over an inventory audit. Vivian came in around 9, which was unusual. She rarely showed up before 10. Dorian was with her. They sat down across from me at the desk that used to be my father's, and Dorian slid a manila envelope across the surface like it was nothing, like it was a purchase order. "What's this?" I asked. "We've made some changes to the management structure," my sister said. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the framed photo of our father on the wall behind me. Inside the envelope was a letter on company letterhead. It thanked me for my contributions. It outlined a severance package. It told me my last day would be that Friday. I looked up at Dorian. He had a smile on his face that I'd seen before, polite and patient, the kind of smile that doesn't reach anything above the cheekbones. "You're doing this now?" I said. "In the middle of a fiscal quarter, without a transition plan, without." "The transition plan is already in place," he said. "We've retained an operations firm out of Vancouver. They start Monday." I looked at my sister. "Vivienne." She finally met my eyes. "This is what's best for the company." "Elliot, I'm family," I said. "I know how that sounds. I said it anyway. That's exactly why we're being generous with severance." I drove home that afternoon with the envelope on the passenger seat and the mountains turning purple in the late light ahead of me. And I sat in my driveway for a long time before I went inside. My mother called that evening. She'd heard. She was apologetic in the way she always got when she'd been outmaneuvered by her own guilt. Quiet, circling, not quite saying the things that needed to be said. She told me that Vivienne and Dorian had concerns about the direction I was taking the company. She told me they thought it was time for fresh eyes. She told me she hoped I understood. I understood perfectly. What I didn't have was any idea what came next. I had some savings. About $6,000, which sounds like more than it is when you're suddenly unemployed in your early 30s and haven't updated your resume in 2 years. I'd been living rent-free in the house I grew up in, which I now realized I needed to leave as quickly as possible. My pride, at least, was still intact. It was my uncle, my father's younger brother, who called me 3 days later. My uncle's name is Bernard, and he lives out near Clearwater, about 4 hours northeast of Pemberton. He's the kind of man who shows up at funerals in work boots because he genuinely forgot he owned dress shoes. He and my father were close growing up, drifted apart in the way that adult siblings sometimes do, but they always had a warmth between them that you could feel even across a room. He'd been at the funeral. He'd shaken Dorian's hand and said very little. "I heard what happened," he said on the phone. "Word travels fast, your mother told me." A pause. "You doing okay? Honestly?" "No." "Right." Another pause. "Listen, your grandfather's fishing cabin, the one out on Lac des Pins, I've been the caretaker of it since he passed. It goes to you now, according to the will. I should have told you sooner, but everything's been, well, it's been a lot." I hadn't thought about that cabin in years. My grandfather, on my father's side, had built it in the 1960s on a small lake about 30 kilometers from the nearest town. It was never a grand place: 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, a dock that needed replanking every few years. We used to go up there when I was young, before everything got complicated and everyone got busy. I remembered the smell of it: pine sap and lake water and old wool. "What kind of shape is it in?" I asked. A long pause. "I won't lie to you, Elliot. It's been sitting empty for the better part of 5 years. There was a bad winter in there. Roof took some damage. I patched what I could, but—" He stopped. "It needs work." "How much work?" "Considerable." I drove out to Lac des Pins the following Saturday with my truck loaded with what I owned and a thermos of coffee that went cold somewhere past Clearwater. The road in was unpaved, lined with spruce and birch, the kind of narrow track that makes you wonder if you've made a wrong turn 3 times before you finally emerge into a small clearing at the water's edge. The cabin was worse than I'd prepared myself for. The front porch had partially collapsed on one side. 2 of the windows were boarded over. The roof, which my uncle had patched, had a visible sag along the ridge that told me the underlying structure had shifted. Inside, there was water damage along the north wall. The linoleum in the kitchen had buckled and cracked, and the wood stove had a crack in the firebox that made it unusable until repaired. The dock was gone entirely, just pilings left in the black water, sticking up like old teeth. I stood in the middle of what had been the living room, and I felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite despair and wasn't quite calm. Something in between. The lake was visible through the window, gray and still under the November sky. A pair of loons called somewhere out in the mist. I'd spent 8 months trying to ace of something that other people were already dismantling. Maybe it was time to save something that actually wanted saving. I had no real construction experience. What I had was stubbornness and access to the Clearwater Public Library's Wi-Fi, which turned out to be more useful than I'd expected. I spent the first 2 weeks doing nothing but reading structural repair guides, old-growth timber framing manuals, how-to forums posted by people in Northern Ontario and Manitoba who'd been through similar situations. I took notes in a yellow legal pad. I watched videos until my eyes ached. The porch was the first job. I pulled the collapsed section apart, salvaged what lumber I could, and replaced the rotadops with pressure-treated fir I hauled in from a building supply in Clearwater. It took me 9 days and 2 trips to the emergency room, one for a gash on my palm, one for a bruised rib from a falling beam that I didn't get clear of in time. I taped the ribs myself and went back to work the next morning because there wasn't much else to do. The roof was the terrifying part. I'm not afraid of heights, but I'm not comfortable on a damaged ridgeline in December, with the temperature sitting at -15. I hired a local man, a retired carpenter named Gus, who lived about 8 kilometers down the road and seemed pleased to have something to do. For 2 days to help me assess and shore up the ridge board. After that, I could do the sheathing and shingles myself. I lived inside the cabin while I worked on it, which I don't recommend. My first month there, I slept in a sleeping bag on a foam pad on the floor of the 2nd bedroom because it had the least water damage, and I woke up every morning to my own breath clouding in front of my face. I got the wood stove operational in mid-December. New firebox liner, new gaskets, new door seal, and that was the first night I actually felt like I might survive the winter. I found the discrepancy in my grandfather's bedroom in late January. I'd been reframing the north wall, the water damage had been worse than it looked, and once I pulled the drywall, I found the insulation was a soggy, molded mess that needed to come out entirely. I'd already removed 4 sections of wall cavity when I noticed that the measurements didn't add up. I'm not a carpenter, but I grew up in a timber company. I know what lumber looks like, and I know how space works. The exterior wall of the bedroom ran about 22 feet across. The interior wall, measured from the doorframe to the corner, was only 19 feet. I'd assumed the difference was a closet, but there was no closet on that wall. Just a long, built-in bookshelf unit that ran floor to ceiling and had always seemed, now that I thought about it, unreasonably deep. I stood in that stripped-down room with a tape measure and a flashlight, and I looked at that bookshelf for a long time. My grandfather was a quiet man, an engineer by training, meticulous in the way that people who've worked with tolerances and load calculations tend to be. He didn't do anything without a reason. He didn't waste space. He certainly didn't build a false wall into his fishing cabin by accident. I started removing the shelves the next morning. Behind them, anchored to a frame that had been built with considerably more care than anything else in that cabin, was a panel of tongue and groove pine. New lumber, or what had been new lumber 30 or 40 years ago. The grain was tight, the boards were straight, and there were no signs of the water damage that had affected everything else in the room. Whatever was behind it had been sealed properly. I used a pry bar carefully. My hands were shaking a little, and I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because I could feel that this was the kind of thing you don't find twice. The panel came away in sections. Behind it was a narrow space, about 3 feet deep, running the full width of the wall. On a low shelf inside, built into the false wall, deliberate and considered, was a metal document box, the kind with a combination lock. Beside it, wrapped in oilcloth, were several paper-wrapped bundles. And beside those, in a clear plastic envelope taped to the back wall, was a sealed letter with my father's name written on the outside. Not my name, my father's. I sat down on the floor of that stripped bedroom, in the cold, with sawdust in my hair and my ribs still aching, and I held that letter for a long time before I opened it. Inside was my grandfather's handwriting, careful, slanted letters in blue ink on pages from a yellow notepad that matched the ones I'd been using to take construction notes, which felt like something, though I couldn't have said what. He'd written the letter in 1987. He explained what was in the metal box and the wrapped bundles. The bundles were bearer bonds, Government of Canada savings bonds, from the 1970s and early 1980s, purchased quietly over years and stored here because, as he wrote, I have watched how money changes people, and I want this to reach the right hands without the wrong hands knowing it exists. He'd meant for my father to find them. He died before he got the chance to tell anyone. The bonds were made out to the bearer. I had no way of knowing their current value without more information, but even a rough count of the denominations told me the number was significant. I photographed everything and drove to Clearwater the next morning. The woman at the bank's investment desk spent an hour with me and a phone call to their bond desk in Vancouver. When she came back to the table, her expression was the careful neutral that people use when they're about to tell you a number that changes the shape of a conversation. The bonds were redeemable. Some had matured decades ago and had continued accumulating interest. The total, after she ran through the calculations twice, came to just under $1.4 million. I drove back to the cabin and I sat on the new porch boards I'd built with my own hands, and I looked at the lake until the light went. My grandfather had left this for my father. My father had never known it was here, and my father was gone. What I did next took me 3 weeks and a lawyer in Kamloops. The estate law around found assets of this type, particularly bearer bonds discovered within inherited property, required careful documentation and proper probate filings. My lawyer, a careful woman who asked good questions and charged fair rates, helped me navigate the process. The bonds were legitimate. The cabin was legitimately mine. The assets were legitimately inheritable. What my lawyer also helped me understand was that the original terms of my grandfather's estate, filed in 1994, when he died, had specified that the cabin and its contents passed to his eldest son, my father, and in the absence of that son, to his male heirs. That language, archaic as it was, meant that Vivienne's claim, if she had one, was indirect at best. I didn't tell my sister or Dorian what I'd found. Not yet. I spent the rest of the winter finishing the cabin. The north wall went up clean, properly insulated with rock wool and new vapor barrier, dry-walled and painted a pale gray that made the room feel twice as large. I built a new dock in March, when the ice started to pull back from the shore, pressure-treated lumber and composite decking, designed to last 20 years without the annual replanning problem. I refinished the floors throughout, repaired the kitchen, replaced both windows that had been boarded. By the time the ice was fully off the lake and the loons were back in mid-April, the cabin looked like something worth staying in. I took photos of every room, before and after. The transformation was, if I'm allowed to say so, remarkable, not because of any genius on my part, but because the bones of the place had always been good, and all it needed was someone willing to do the work. The conversation with my sister and Dorian happened in May. I'd asked them to meet me in Kamloops, neutral ground, my lawyer's boardroom. I told them it was about the estate. Dorian assumed it was about the severance dispute. I'd filed a complaint with the Employment Standards Branch in January, which he'd dismissed as a nuisance move. He came in looking pleased with himself, which was something I'd seen often enough that it no longer surprised me. My lawyer presented the documentation, the discovery of the assets, the probate filing, the estate law analysis, the bonds and their value. Dorian's expression changed somewhere around the third page. Vivienne was quiet through most of it. She asked 2 questions, both precise, both about the legal mechanisms, not about me, which told me everything I needed to know about where her mind was. She wasn't thinking about my grandfather. She wasn't thinking about my father. She was doing math, what she and Dorian didn't know, and what my lawyer explained at the end of the presentation was that the terms of the original estate, that specific old-fashioned language about male heirs, had one additional complication for them. My grandfather had also, in the same document, specified that any contestation of the estate's terms by a beneficiary acting in bad faith would result in that beneficiary forfeiting their claim to any secondary assets covered under the estate. My employment at Marsh Timber had been contingent on my status as an active family member in good standing. My termination by a company whose controlling interest was now entangled with my grandfather's estate created, according to my lawyer, an interesting question of fiduciary obligation. We weren't suing them. I want to be clear about that. I'm not interested in destroying the company my father built. What we were doing was renegotiating the terms of my departure and establishing a legal basis for my continued involvement in decisions affecting assets that traced back to my grandfather's original estate. Dorian said, at one point, "This is a bad faith maneuver." He was looking at my lawyer when he said it, not at me. I said, "I learned about bad faith from watching you hand me a termination letter at my father's desk." He didn't have an answer for that. The agreement we reached over the next several weeks wasn't dramatic. I'm not going to pretend there was a moment where Dorian was humiliated in front of a crowd, or my sister burst into tears of apology. Real life is quieter than that. What happened was that the proceeds from the bonds were formally recognized as mine, with no claim from the corporate estate. My complaint with the Employment Standards Branch was settled with a payment that represented my actual lost wages plus the severance I should have received in the first place. And as a condition of the overall estate settlement, I retained the right to appoint one member to the company's advisory board. Not a controlling position, not a seat at the operational table, but a voice. I appointed my Uncle Bernard. He showed up to the first meeting in clean work boots, which I counted as an improvement. My mother called me the night after the settlement was finalized. It was a long call, the kind where the silences are as important as what's said. She told me she was sorry. She said it without qualifiers, without explanations, which was the first time she'd done that in a long time. I told her I knew. I told her I didn't hold it against her. I think that was true. I'm still working out which parts were. I live at the cabin now, at least for part of the year. I've been doing consulting work. Supply chain analysis, the kind of thing I learned from 8 months of trying to save a company that didn't want saving, and it turns out there's good money in it, and I can do it from anywhere with decent internet, which the cabin now has thanks to a satellite dish I mounted to the south gable in June. In the evenings, I sit on the dock I built and watch the light go across the lake. The loons are reliably present. The water is cold even in August. Sometimes I think about my grandfather sitting in this same spot, watching this same lake, deciding that some things were worth protecting from the people who would spend them carelessly. He chose the right place to hide what mattered. It just took the right person finding it to understand why. I think he knew, somehow, that the person who repaired the walls would be the person who deserved what was inside them. That's probably giving him too much credit. He was an engineer, not a prophet. But engineers design for the long term. They build intolerances. They assume the worst and plan for someone steady enough to handle it. I like to think I handled it. The dock needs a new cleat on the starboard side. One of the bolts has started to back out from the freeze-thaw cycles. I'll fix it this weekend. There's always something to fix. I've stopped finding that discouraging.